to the third annual Faculty Research Group on Immigrant Workers, Global Goes Local on the social conditions of immigrant workers and families in Minnesota. Thank you very much to Dean Bavardson for that very warm welcome to everybody, and what a great kickoff. I love to have this problem at our conferences when we don't have enough chairs. So with no further ado, I just want to very quickly give you a very brief intro to the first guest speaker. And by the way, just in case you should need to leave to get ready for the next panels, we more than understand, so don't feel ashamed of if you need to get up and leave early or earlier. Not too early. Okay. Attorney John Keller is Executive Director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, a nonprofit that advocates for low-income immigrants and refugees. The Immigrant Law Center was founded in 1976 as Oficina Legal, a program of Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services. It was later renamed to reflect the increasing diversity of the immigrant population it served. Over the last decade, it has established itself as Minnesota's premier provider of comprehensive immigration legal services to low-income clients of all nationalities. John's topic is entirely topical, given one of the fundamental problems that immigrants in this country, especially newly arrived ones, are facing today, which is their increasing criminalization, especially with the political season upon us. His topic is the impact of Arizona and Alabama's anti-immigrant laws on Minnesota's immigrants' efforts to secure citizenship rights. Please give a very warm welcome to John Keller.
Good morning. Just a moment. Need a little technical assistance. My name is John Keller. While we're getting the PowerPoint pulled up, the Immigrant Law Center in Minnesota feels really loud. Is it really loud? No, it's okay. Is a nonprofit. The work that we do provides lawyers and education assistance to immigrants and refugees from all over the world. Last year, the Immigrant Law Center in Minnesota worked on 3,500 legal matters, and our clients came from 90 different countries. Our work is statewide, so we serve anybody in Minnesota with the work that we do, and the criteria for our services is that you are low income, that you or your family member have the need to interact with the Immigration Service, now USCIS, and that we have the capacity to serve you. All three of those need to be met. There needs to be a remedy, there needs to be something that can be done for you. So that automatically means that many people were unable to help. So I'm going to try to get us back on track and move kind of quickly. The topic that I was asked to speak about today is the trends of states taking on immigration legislation. And so I'll begin just with a little bit of information about the center and then jump right into the topic. That's who we are, that's what we do. In addition to the legal work, which is the bulk of our budget, the bulk of our staff, we also do education, so conferences like this. We have a special program also that works with youth to go into the middle schools and high schools to educate both citizen youth and non-citizen youth about immigration, about rights and responsibilities, and then also to the professional community. We've done a lot of work over the last 5-6 years with law enforcement, co-training with law enforcement, training law enforcement about immigrants, immigrant rights. The rights of immigrant victims of crimes is one of our most common areas of teaching. And then finally, the last part of our mission and work is systems change. We work at both the state and federal level on both supporting positive legislation as well as trying to defeat negative legislation. So here's what we'll try to cover. There are PowerPoints, copies of PowerPoints on your table. There are some extra copies circulating, so if you want to take one home and frame it, you can do that as well. And so here's what we'll cover. First and foremost, in terms of a background, if you're walking into this today and you don't follow immigration regularly, first of all, good fortune to you. Secondly, this one slide is supposed to set the backdrop for what's going on in the context of why these states are passing immigration laws. First of all, one of the things that we talk about and make sure the audience walks away with is the idea, the fact that the US Constitution requires uniform legislation when it comes to certain areas of law. If you think of US tax law, for example, if you live in Arizona or if you live in Minnesota, the same level of US tax law should be applied to you. If you think also of environmental law, there's a threshold that the states can't go below for protecting the environment regulated by the US government. The same is true around immigration. So bullet point number 1, immigration is federal. The need for somebody living in St. Cloud to have the same opportunity to become a US citizen as somebody living in Washington, D.C. or in Florida is ensconced in the Constitution. So moving on from there, if you wanted to address current immigration law, or for good or for bad, where should it be done? But in Washington, D.C. So Washington, if we're going to address any aspect of immigration law, it has to be passed through the House, the Senate, and signed by the President. That, of course, for any bill these days is a big challenge. Finding bipartisanship, finding a way in which we can come together to pass legislation. The states, because of that absence, because of the hope that the federal government, that our elected officials in Washington are going to be able to take this on and reform some of the broken aspects, states have jumped into that breach. The most obvious and most well-known state is Arizona, and we'll move into Arizona in just a second. But states really have become the battleground for legislating or trying to legislate around immigration. Usually it's attempts to legislate to make life more difficult for immigrants. In the backdrop of the states doing that, the political mechanism or the political idea shared by both President Bush and President Obama has been, if we do enough enforcement, if we arrest and deport enough people, eventually a bipartisan level of support will arise so that we can fix the broken aspects of immigration. When I talk about broken aspects, we're really talking about very long delays for family members to immigrate legally to the United States, shortage of worker visas for entry-level or low-skilled workers to enter the United States, as well as high-skilled. So those are some of the examples. This is just a slide to show you, to emphasize that both administrations have taken very seriously that political strategy of proving their bona fides in terms of deportations, record-breaking deportations. So that's what's going on at the federal level. And now we enter Arizona. Anybody not hear about the laws passed in Arizona? Nobody. One person in the back. So in Arizona, the preface, the reason for Arizona's laws that were passed a couple years ago was to create such an environment, such a negative environment for the undocumented that they would automatically self-deport. That's the written, literal emphasis of SB 1070. SB 1070 is the name of the law that was passed. It's become known as attrition by enforcement. Candidate Romney has adopted that strategy, attrition by enforcement, when he mentioned that Arizona was a set of laws that he'd like to emulate if he were to become president. And the biggest challenge, if you go back to where I started my conversation, is that the federal law, or the Constitution, requires that immigration be federal. So the big conflict that's set up by states passing their own immigration law is that of preemption. Again, examples of a preemption where the federal government has said, we're going to occupy this area. This is our territory. This is our responsibility. Include areas such as environmental or minimum wage laws. Immigration is in that same category. And the U.S. Department of Justice then, after Arizona passed its laws, sued the state of Arizona. What exactly is in the Arizona law? What did they decide to do? What are the new ways in which they're legislating? You can see here from the bullet points. So warrantless arrests are permitted by law enforcement where probable cause exists for law enforcement to believe that the person they're about to arrest is deportable. This could be somebody who has legal status, so it could be a permanent resident. If a records check shows that they have a conviction for drugs in Minnesota, but they're in Arizona, that permanent resident could be arrested without a warrant. If it's an undocumented person who shows through their background check that they've got a deportation order, that person also could be arrested without a warrant. Again, this is new territory for a state to begin to put state laws in place instead of federal laws. It's also, under the SB 1070, a crime for people who are undocumented to apply for, to solicit work in a public place, or to perform work in Arizona. So this is particularly targeted at people waiting to be picked up at 7-Elevens in Arizona. And then the last bullet point is really where we saw the most controversy arise, or one of the areas that it was most controversial. It requires the state and local police to determine the immigration status if, excuse me, if there's reasonable suspicion that that person is undocumented. And it led to the famous question of the governor, Governor Jan Brewer, after this passed, Governor, can you tell us what the criteria are for somebody who's undocumented? What does that person look like? And also, I may need some help getting the YouTube video up here. It led to a campaign, here we go, like this. So the counter push back against SB 1070 used the attempts to show just how difficult it will be for local law enforcement when they come across somebody to make those determinations. The county attorney in Phoenix opposed SB 1070. There was one of the many lawsuits that came out against SB 1070 was from a local sheriff. It really put local police in the position of having to make a decision that was sort of in between a rock and a hard place. If they don't arrest, they could be sued, and if they do arrest somebody who is in fact a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, they'd be guilty of racial profiling. So here's some of the main controversies. Some of these I've already covered. The need for states. Are states going to take on immigration enforcement? Or is the federal government going to do it? Profiling of people who look suspicious of being here in an undocumented status or having lapsed visas. The inaction of Washington is a common refrain when talking about Arizona. If Washington's not going to do anything, then we here in Arizona will. And it also led to division within the state of Arizona itself, as you might imagine. The business community, the Chamber of Commerce joined with the ACLU, perhaps in the first time, in a lawsuit against Arizona, so think of that. ACLU very far to the left, and the Chamber of Commerce traditionally to the right. said this is bad for Arizona, we don't want this. Law enforcement, as I mentioned, and public opinion was divided. So where is SB 1070 today? As I mentioned, the United States Department of Justice, so the federal government sued the state of Arizona and said, what you're doing exceeds what a state can do around immigration. We own immigration as a federal government. The Ninth Circuit upheld an injunction that barred the law from going into place. And now the Supreme Court of the United States will hear Arizona versus the United States in just 2 weeks, on April 25th. The very debate about whether Arizona's actions are lawful or not will be heard by the highest court in the land. One interesting little-known fact about the argument and the case at the Supreme Court is that one of the justices, Elena Kagan, recused herself because she had worked on this issue or advised on this issue when she worked for the president. And so there'll be 8 justices deciding the case. As you know, if you follow the healthcare debate at the Supreme Court, the court is deeply split along political lines. The reason we have 9 justices, I feel like I'm giving the citizenship exam for new America. How many justices are there? There's 9. Why do we have 9? To avoid ties. On this case, Arizona versus the United States, will have 8 justices hearing the case and deciding the case. So other effects on what happened with SB 1070, the reputation of Arizona has become part of the campaign. One of the areas in which the state kept moving after SB 1070 was passed was they banned Mexican-American studies in one of the largest school districts. They said Mexican-American studies leads to brown people hating white people. They're educating youth to overthrow the government. I had another great YouTube clip from The Daily Show, which I recommend you find. I think it was from last week or the week before, of an interview of one of the commissioners of the Department of Education down there by one of John Daly's reporters. But I thought if I put that up, no one would want to listen to me afterwards. So it shows that SB 1070 didn't sort of stop, it kept moving. Economic impact of SB 1070 on Arizona. One of the business groups in Arizona estimated a loss of $500 million in tourism in 2011, 3,000 tourism jobs lost, 60% of the lettuce crop lost, the cost of lettuce was doubled. And then the other most recent, in just the fall, November 2011, Russell Pierce, the author of SB 1070, a state senator, lost his seat in one of the few recalls of a sitting senator. So in lots of ways, even though it passed in 2010, or April 2009, the bill continued to move forward in terms of public opinion, understanding what was going on and what the impacts would be, ultimately leading to the very senator who introduced it losing his seat. So that's SB 1070, again, as I mentioned, to be continued on April 25th when the court hears that case. Following SB 1070 in Arizona, other states began to pick up on what Arizona had done. And the most recent, declaring itself as the nation's toughest immigration law, occurred in Alabama with HB 56 in Alabama. I put some of the exact language on there because they went in a new direction that Arizona did not. They said under Section 28 that every public elementary and secondary school at the time of enrollment in kindergarten or at any grade shall determine whether the student was born outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. or is the child of an alien not lawfully present in the U.S. Any teachers out there? High school, elementary and high school? Currently, under a U.S. Supreme Court decision from 1987, we've declared as the law of the land in the United States that every young person in the United States has a right to a public education. That decision is Plyler versus Doe, came out of Texas, as I said, in '87. And what Alabama did is to say, we're not going to forbid students from enrolling in Alabama schools. We're just going to collect this data. We're going to collect the data, And the last bullet point that you need to know to understand the impact of this on immigrant families, many of them mixed status, is that the schools also can't prevent anyone who works at those schools from sharing that data with the federal government. So once you collect the data, how do you keep that data from scaring folks from putting their kids in school? They also took one step further and said that under Section 8 of HB 56, no undocumented student can attend or enroll in college. So that's the standout piece of 56. These other pieces are also part of HB 56, and some of them you'll see are directly pulled from the Arizona law. They put a provision in that said no contracts will be honored. If a contract is knowingly entered into somebody who's undocumented, that contract can't be honored by the courts. They also said that it's a felony if an undocumented, these are all state laws, remember the state is legislating here. It's a felony for persons who are undocumented to contract to get a driver's license, a business license. It's a crime, an Alabama law to be undocumented in the state of Alabama. To rent to somebody who's undocumented is a crime, to work, and then to give a ride to anybody who's undocumented. The church, the faith community came out quite strongly against this bill. The same reasonable suspicion standard is in there for law enforcement. You must contact the federal government if you have a reasonable suspicion somebody's unlawfully present. If that person is arrested and booked, they can't be released unless the federal government's is made aware of them being there, and until the federal government comes to pick them up. Some of the consequences of HB 56 included a comment from the Commissioner of Agriculture that the economic hardship to farmers and agribusiness is going to reverberate throughout Alabama's economy. 1/5 of all jobs came from farming, particularly tomato crops. The University of Alabama, a study reported an estimated $10 billion loss, 140,000 jobs lost, and a loss of combined state and local revenue, tax revenue of $350 million. Real life impact of the school provision, you can see there in the third bullet point, 2,285 Latino kids were absent the first Monday after this went into effect, an 80% increase from the previous Monday. Again, in this circumstance in Alabama, the U.S. Department of Justice enters into a lawsuit against the state. And because of the way in which it was seeking to restrict access to education, they also pulled in protections under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, discrimination in the provision of education due to race and national origin. And there you see the cite to Plyler v. Doe. One additional real-life impact, since it is now illegal to contract for an undocumented person to contract with the state, water and gas, provision of water and gas was annulled. This is an actual notice that went up in the town of Allgood, Alabama. I don't know if you can read it or not, but you have to prove your immigration status in order to get water. People lost water connections. As I mentioned, litigation began by the Department of Justice. The Federal Court of Appeals in the 11th Circuit, the circuit that governs Alabama, one of the more conservative courts in the country, enjoined most of Alabama's laws, both in October and then in just March of this year. The ultimate decision as to whether pieces or all of Alabama's law will go into effect is likely to be governed by the Arizona litigation at the Supreme Court. That wasn't me, that balloon noise. There also almost immediately began to be an outcry. As you saw in terms of the consequences, the business community particularly was concerned about the loss of economic revenue because of these laws. And so there was a big push almost immediately from the business community to encourage revisions to HB 56. So HB 56 has had many proposed revisions. None of them, of course, have ultimately gone into law. One of the kind of flashpoints of HB 56 was the arrest of a Mercedes executive, a German citizen in Alabama for business purposes. His rental car didn't have a license plate. He was pulled over. He didn't have a driver's license, and he was booked into jail. The impact, again, you can see why the business community in Alabama is concerned. More than 40,000 Alabama jobs are owed to foreign automakers, both Mercedes-Benz as well as Hyundai. At significant tax subsidies, so the state's residents already subsidized to bring these companies into Alabama, only to have one of their executives arrested. He was finally released when one of his colleagues went back to his hotel to get his passport to prove that he had a legal right to be in Alabama. So the national impact of these states legislating in the void of federal action, first of all, it has not spurred the federal government to begin legislating. If anything, the federal government's as polarized, if not more polarized. Additional states have jumped in with large omnibus bills like Arizona's and Alabama's, Georgia, Utah, South Carolina, Indiana, Mississippi almost passed one very recently. And the federal government or other lawsuits are pending in each of those states. You can see the increase of states legislating bills, actual bills being introduced in states across the country. So last year, for the first time, all 50 states plus Puerto Rico introduced immigrant-based legislation, most of these enforcement-related. 1,600 in 2011 versus 1,400 in 2010. States are beginning to move towards their own E-Verify systems. E-Verify is a federal database that checks the legal employment eligibility by workers, and now states are moving in that direction, including Minnesota. And then we move into Minnesota. So Minnesota, I put this slide in just because it shows some of the history or background of the population that's in Minnesota today. I think the most important slide really is, or bullet point, is that we're about in the middle of the pack when it comes to the percentage of our population that is foreign-born relative to other states. In fact, compared to the national average, we have about half the percentage of our population as the national average does that are foreign-born. So still, an extremely white state. In Minnesota, what we've seen really since 2007 is an increasing number of bills being introduced at the state level, the state of Minnesota, around immigration. And I just put together some copies here, or some examples of bills, both last session and this session. So immediately following the passage of the Arizona bill, Minnesota itself introduced a copy of that Arizona bill in H-File 3830. It was introduced late in the session, so it did not make it out of session, out of the committees, but still it was introduced. There was, in last year's budget round, restriction, a bill that was passed by both houses, vetoed by the governor ultimately, that would have restricted legal aid organizations like Immigrant Law Center and traditional legal aid offices from doing any work on behalf of federal matter cases. Obviously, immigration is federal, and that would have affected certainly our office and other legal aid offices. There was a bill, both last session and this session, banning separation ordinances. If you've followed separation ordinances, they are the laws that exist in Minneapolis and St. Paul that say local police officers will do local police work. They will not ask in a traffic stop, for example, whether or not you're legally in the United States. Those two local ordinances exist in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The bill introduced last session and again this session would make that illegal. It went one step further by giving a private right of action. So if you happen to be driving down the road and you saw, let's say, a Minneapolis police officer finish up his business on a traffic stop and a Latino driver drives away, if you had reason to believe that that local Minneapolis police officer didn't inquire about immigration, you could file a lawsuit against Minneapolis Police Department saying, I just saw this guy not turn somebody over. That private right of action, again, in last year's bill and in this year's bill, giving anyone the ability to sue a unit of government that they believe is not enforcing immigration law. A bill last year declaring English as the official language in Minnesota. E-Verify bill last year that did become law in the special session. Of course, voter ID. There isn't a lot of mention about undocumented or non-citizens voting in voter ID, but it does come up occasionally. A new crime for people who are found with 2 documents that don't belong to them. A new forgery ground was introduced last year. Secure Communities, anybody hear of Secure Communities? Secure Communities is a database by the federal government that anytime a person is booked into a local jail or a county jail, those fingerprints are shared automatically, not just with the FBI, but also with the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration. So Secure Communities was introduced as a requirement for the state of Minnesota. That was vetoed by the governor. And then finally, again, in a budget setting year, which was last year, one of the areas they sought to make up ground financially was by cutting who could and who would be covered by emergency medical assistance. Emergency medical assistance in Minnesota is a state-sponsored pool of money for people both legally here and those who are undocumented who have suffered severe health emergencies. Unfortunately, that bill did get passed and the governor signed it during the special session. The impact, just to give you an idea of the impact of one of those bills that went into legislation, we'll follow up after this slide on 2012 about what EMA cuts did. So this is this year, this is the session that's still active in St. Paul. The separation ordinance ban has gone to the House floor. E-Verify expansion bill requiring businesses to use E-Verify if they have a contract with the state. There's a bill that would require the Department of Public Safety and the Department of Human Services to share data. In February of 2012, Secure Communities became the law in Minnesota, so this was not through the state legislative action, but through action in Washington and a change of policy by the Obama administration. The constitutional amendment on voter ID is headed to a ballot near you. There was a bill this year, an anti-Sharia law bill, which didn't even get a committee hearing, but the idea was that no one could profess to have entered into a contract with Sharia law. Funding for integration in high schools particularly was cut last year. The impacts are being felt this year. And then, as I mentioned, the impact of the cuts on emergency medical assistance. When medical assistance was cut, emergency medical assistance, there was a list of 24 conditions that basically said, we'll no longer cover these conditions. Again, this is state-based. This is the state saying these areas are areas which, because you're not a U.S. citizen, we're not going to provide this care for you. So kidney dialysis or chemotherapy, doctor and clinic visits, nursing homes, mental health care. Happy to say that we are in the process of negotiating with the Department of Human Services. There is hope that some of these revisions will be cut back with a fairer interpretation of what the federal law requires. Finally, looking over the horizon, where does all of this lead us? As you all know, we are in the midst of a presidential campaign. The last presidential campaign in 2008 featured candidate Obama and candidate McCain, both of whom had voted in favor of comprehensive immigration reform in 2006 when they were both senators. Immigration, in essence, in the last presidential campaign was held as sort of a detente issue. Both candidates supported the federal government fixing several of the broken areas that I talked about, That is unlikely to be the case as we get closer to election day this year. There are small but hopefully relevant executive actions taken by President Obama. One of them allows for prosecutorial discretion for some of the hardship cases if they're moving through deportation. For example, there's one of the clearest areas where law enforcement, where ICE officials are urged to not follow through with deportation is for DREAM Act eligible youth. So young people who, if the DREAM Act were to pass, would be eligible to get DREAM Act benefits, can also petition to have prosecutorial discretion exercised to temporarily stay their deportation. Other areas include people who are very ill or who have a strong connection, mostly meaning U.S. citizen family in the United States. There's also, just last week, public comment was opened around petitioning for, if you're a U.S. citizen who's petitioning for a family member, usually a spouse, instead of making that wait for your spouse occur outside the United States, a wait that can often be very dangerous, can last up to 18 months, if not longer. New interpretation would allow for that wait to happen inside the U.S. while you're waiting to get your visa. Would affect many of our clients positively. As I mentioned, Arizona is going to be argued at the U.S. Supreme Court. The consequences of the Arizona decision can't be underestimated. As you've already seen, several states with the passage of SB 1070 in Arizona already began to copy that. 6 states, as we mentioned. One of the interesting twists, every time a state decides whether or not they're going to copy and implement wholesale Arizona, is the regional differences. So Alabama went further in a restrictionist mode with their efforts to legislate around children. Utah, on the other hand, another state that copied large parts of Arizona, decided, again with the business community chiming in Utah, that they needed to create a state-based authorization for the undocumented workers. So you sort of see states beginning to experiment and go in 2 different directions. Utah, again, has also been sued by the U.S. government. One of the less obvious consequences of all of the energy in the room being focused on enforcement and cracking down on undocumented immigrants is the lack of appetite or the lack of willingness to look at immigration and immigrants as a positive source of work, of income, of culture in states. So that's one of the lost opportunities, both here in Minnesota and other places. With that, a list of resources, if you'd like to continue to study and learn more about some of the issues I've talked about is there for you. Contact information for myself and for the center. And I see some people have to get up and leave, but we also have a few minutes for questions. If people have questions, I'd be happy to take them.
And just to let people know, there'll be a 5:30 reception in Atwood at Voyagers, and all are welcome to attend it. And it's being put on courtesy of the School of Public Affairs. Dean Bavard very generously contributed to making that possible. So we start with Q&A.
I read a feature article in Business Week, and there have been other sources, that one of the biggest lobbyists for Arizona's restrictive immigration law was the private prison industry. And I just spent some time in Florida recently, and the Florida legislature voted down privatization of their prisons after a lot of pressure. And I wonder what your response is. Who are the big players in supporting these, and what gains would they get out of it?
Yeah, so the question is around who are the interests lobbying for laws like Arizona. One of the big scoops that came out shortly after Arizona's laws passed was that a lot of the model legislation that, depending on whose point of view you listen to, was either promoted or created jointly with ALEC. ALEC is a large lobbying organization, ALEC, and ALEC puts on an annual conference every year. One of the main themes that ALEC had been promoting for several years was a state-based approach to legislation around immigration. So ALEC definitely is one of those promoters. The idea of private prisons is nothing new. The new population to be imprisoned at a profit, of course, the fastest growing is immigrants for private prisons. There was significant evidence that the private prison industry was also lobbying for Arizona and other areas. And now one of the battles has become to try to stop new private prisons from being constructed in areas where there's a high level of immigrant population. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the proactive measures that are being taken on immigration?
Proactive measures about immigration?
Yeah, at
Yep.
the state level.
At the state level,
Or in other states.
yeah. Well, the interesting, as I mentioned, the interesting debate really around states and immigration is, on the one hand, if you have lawyers stand up and say, immigration is a federal issue, states should stay out of it. That should apply both to both positive and negative efforts. I think the big question the U.S. Supreme Court is going to have to wrestle with, and this will probably determine the direction in which the Arizona decision goes, is to what degree does what federal immigration law occupy the field also cover police actions? So traditionally, police actions within a state are grounds of the state, and they have a lot of latitude to work in that area. So that, I think, is going to determine where the court comes down on the Arizona case. If you're dealing with an issue outside of police actions, so a good example is the promotion of U.S. citizenship, a very safe area for states or even cities to take on and say, you know what, we care about our legal permanent residents, persons who are eligible to apply for citizenship, to move forward and to become a full-fledged U.S. citizen. We're going to sponsor and put funding towards citizenship classes, towards English acquisition classes, and even towards service agencies that will help promote people to that next level. It's politically very easy to see both sides agreeing on that sort of an issue. It's an area where we have met with the governor here in Minnesota, and the governor would support that, as well as the business community. The problem with a lot of the positive issues or positive initiatives is we're also in the midst of scarcity. So the ability to provide any resources, particularly resources to people who are not yet U.S. citizens, is a risk that a lot of politicians aren't willing to take. So a lot of our work, a lot of the work of people who would support positive initiatives, unfortunately, as I mentioned in that one last bullet point, is being occupied in trying to push back against negative issues. But I think we will get there. I think, you know, as I drove up this morning, for the first time I heard that there may be a lack of appetite for voices like Rush Limbaugh. You know, are we actually moving beyond sort of you know, the most extreme opinions getting all of the energy in the room? If we are, I think immigration is one of those areas traditionally where bipartisan agreement has been the only way in which we've been able to make some changes, and you know, that's where we'd be headed, hopefully after the elections in November. Yeah.
You mentioned the economic impact of these particular laws in Alabama and Arizona. Has there been a discussion about how to adjust it to the downfall of the economy over the same years, or is there some way to tease out what was the actual impact of those laws versus just the economy going down?
Yeah, I've not looked closely at, you know, pulling out those two pieces.
But is there a discussion about that, or are people discussing? I think people who are debating whether or not these laws really impacted. Is there discussion about that?
Part of what I've seen looked at by economists in terms of the impact nationally of these kinds of laws, as well as the economy on immigrants, is that the number one factor on net migration to the United States is the economy, right? Most people haven't heard this, but last year, for the first time since I think 1972 or 73, there was zero net migration on the Mexican border. You know, and certainly we have more agents, we have more law enforcement there, but what economists argue, and economists who study immigration, is that one of the most significant contributions is the lack of economic opportunity, with people leaving as well as people choosing not to come at this time. So they're definitely interrelated. I don't have the data on how much this data corresponds to that. Yes?
Yes, the students always ask, well, aren't these people illegal, they're criminals, and I don't know if you talked about this in the beginning, but do these state laws, is that part of what they're doing, is trying to add issues that make acts illegal, or because people, you know, we often hear students say, well, they're criminals, so what do we care, they should just go home, and how do you react to all that?
So part of what the states are doing is to create state-based crimes, right, that don't exist right now, or didn't exist before these states acted. If you enter the United States without a visa or in an unauthorized fashion, yes, you're breaking the law. That, you know, we can't debate that. The severity of the law, it's a misdemeanor at the federal level, but it's a federal crime. What the states have done, as you saw in many of my examples, is they've sort of begun their own way of targeting what are the ways in which we can drive people out of our state. So, you know, you have both cities like Hazleton, that was in the news very early in these debates. I forget the name of the city in Nebraska. There was a recent initiative in Nebraska as well to make it illegal to rent to anybody. You can't, it'd be a crime for me if I had a rental property to rent to somebody who's undocumented. But really the effort is, just like in the preface of the Arizona law, to make life so miserable for folks that they'll go back to, you know, most often places that were so miserable that they left everything to come here. You know, so lots of what we do with immigration policy, I wouldn't say is logical or follows us, you know, a lot of deep thinking, unfortunately. There's a lot of reaction in a lot of the state-based laws are reacting to a problem that I don't think you can deny exists, particularly in states like Arizona that have a much larger population that's undocumented than Minnesota. But the solutions that they're proposing, you know, if there's any good that comes out of them, our hope would be that it sort of kickstarts the federal officials' ability to work together to try to address some of these issues.